Greetings, my friends, out there everywhere. It is a real pleasure, as always, to be with you this day, and I truly hope that everything is well with you, and I'm happy to report that all is well with me. I was had a request to give something fitting to the Christmas season. Fortunately, I have a rare story. It's not so rare anymore because I've used it on several occasions, but the story of the first Christmas in Bristol. We do have a record of that, handed down through one family, and I was fortunate to become the recipient of the story and of also an article that goes with it. Of course, we first of all need to give you a background of early Bristol. The town was surveyed beginning on August 1, 1852. That year the maps were made and lots were offered for sale in the new town of Bristol, Virginia, Tennessee. The original town included both Virginia and Tennessee portions. Now, nothing was built. At the time it was laid off, it was a meadow, and at one extreme southern edge was row crops, cultivated land, but most of it, especially that which lay in Virginia, was meadow land, pasture land. And the map, of course, laid out in that area was marked off with stakes and flags, little tufts of cloth on top of them to show where the streets and the lots were. But no building was done in the original plan of Bristol until 1853. At that time, Joseph Ray Anderson, the founder of Bristol, Tennessee, Virginia, had a building erected which was a multi-purpose, at least dual-purpose building. It was for his home and also for his store building. Actually, he put aside one large room in the house for a store. The first post office in Bristol was in that store also, in that building. Eventually, the first bank was set up in the corner of that building, and actually 13 firsts were connected to that building and lot. But we will not go into those today. That is another story. What is important to us is that Anderson stocked his store. Now, how would it have been done in those days? The railroad hadn't reached here. Certainly there were no trucking lines. Actually, enterprising people, a few, had set up freight lines using wagons to haul goods, mostly from Baltimore, but some from Philadelphia and a few from as far away as New York City. Anderson dealt mostly with the Baltimore wholesalers, and his goods were brought here by wagon train. They were in boxes, but not the kind of boxes you see today. Instead of cardboard boxes, they were wooden crates or wooden boxes. He stocked his store that way and sent out word that he would be opening for business on December 24th, 1853. Now then, today we well know that merchants usually have offerings for this season as early as September, maybe even earlier, but I think September is the first I have ever known. But in those days it was not so. In my old home up here, Old Pleasant Hill, there's all kinds of old papers, including a lot of old newspapers of that period and much later into the 60s and 70s. It was in the 70s that I read one day, just going through those, that a merchant apologized for not having his stock out 3 days before Christmas. Well, that would be 3 months now. Anyway, Anderson had sent out word that I'll be opening for business on December 24th, Christmas Eve. 1853. Now then, we must switch the scene in order to bring our story to the place we want it to be. At that time, there lived on what we now call King College Road. It was just a road leading into the country then. Near that road, there was a family. The family name, I don't have the first names of all of them, but the family name was Rutherford, which was an old pioneer and is one of our pioneer families here today. This family had a son who had recently married, and well, recently, at least 5 years prior, because they had had 3 children. 2 had died, but the oldest remained with them, little Rebecca, who at the time was about 5 years old. Well, of course, the young man wanted to get a start in agriculture, but it was a little difficult for beginners because most of this land had already been taken up at that time. But there was good news. The government was offering free land at various places in the West, and one of them being Union County, Illinois, that borders on the Mississippi River in western Illinois. I know because my great-grandfather also went there to take up land. He did not stay, but he did take up land in that county. The deal was you had to live on the land for so many years and develop it, and then the government would issue a clear deed to it. It was offered in tracts of 40, and somewhat based on the number in the family members. Others might get more. We'll have a little more on that later. This young man decided to go west and seek his fortune. Taking his family by wagon, he moved to Union County, Illinois, which is about 500 miles, roughly 500 miles from here. Long journey, of course, but that was common in those days. He found his land, settled down, and hoped to prosper in the new land. Meanwhile, Philip Bushong, that's another pioneer family in this area, already doing well here with a large acreage, and so much that it was called a plantation, Old Stony Point, which still exists, but it's covered with homes now. That is, it exists in area, but is now covered in homes like Greystone, Redstone, Middlebrook. Those parts of Bristol are on his old plantation, but he thought he might do better out there. Rich land along the Mississippi, and his plan was to buy up several of those claims from others who had set them up and establish a big plantation. So he journeyed by horseback the 500 miles to Union County, Illinois. Well, of course, he was a stranger in a strange land, but he did know this young couple that had moved out there. And so he moved in with them as a boarder in their home until he could find what he wanted, more and more land, of course. Well, sometime in the late fall, possibly in October, late October, some kind of a disease ravaged that country. They called them plagues. I really don't know, and my informants of long ago were not sure what it was. May have been typhoid, cholera, or maybe yellow fever or something of that nature hit the land. Many people died, dozens of them, as often happens in plagues like that. Sadly, the young man, of whom I have told you before, took this disease and soon died. Then, within a few days, his wife came down with that disease, and she also died. This left little Rebecca, 5 years old, an orphan in a strange land. Luckily, she didn't become ill. Mr. Bushong had served as a county officer in Sullivan County, and he knew what would happen. The sheriff of the county would take charge of her, and try to find a home for her. He did not want her left among strangers, and so, knowing that the weather was going to be cold, he quickly bought a real heavy wool blanket. And the next morning before daylight, he took the little girl, wrapped her in the blanket, put her on the horse behind him, and they left the jurisdiction of Union County, Illinois, where she would have been taken over by the sheriff's department and put out somewhere in a home. He just didn't want to put among strangers, and so he developed a plan to bring her back to Sullivan County, Tennessee, to her grandparents, who were still living here. Actually, they knew nothing of what had happened in Illinois. You see, word didn't travel much in those days. And sometimes letters and so on, but I don't think they knew anything about what had happened in Illinois. They rode, of course, across Illinois. Now, at 5, the girl remembered a lot about that trip. She remembered crossing the river by a ferry boat at Louisville, Kentucky. And incidentally, I tell this to be a little facetious, Mr. Bushong, shall we say, bought himself a blanket in Louisville. Actually, it was a flask of whiskey. I tell you that to inform you that the bottle in which that was contained still exists. It's here in Bristol. I have it in my old home here in Bristol, Virginia. But people used to think it helped them to stay warm, and maybe he did, because the weather was getting real cold by that time. They journeyed on. She remembered coming through Kentucky, they'd stop at various homes along the road to spend the night. It was common in those days. It may seem strange now to us to think of just traveling through the land and not knowing anyone and yet stopping with people for the night. It was considered a duty of people in those days to take in strangers from the road. And sometimes they were turned down, but most of the time people would take you in. And that's the way that they made their way through Kentucky. But somewhere she thought it was in south central Kentucky. Mr. Bushong became ill, not with the disease that he had had back in Illinois, but something pretty serious. And little Rebecca, as young as she was, felt an anxiety, thinking, what if he should die? Well, Philip Bushong was thinking about that too. And so he made arrangements with that family that if he should die in this strange land, that some of that family would continue the journey and bring the little child safely home. In her old days, little Rebecca talked about passage through the Cumberland Gap. The reason she remembered, otherwise it would just been a mountain valley to her. But Mr. Bushong, a very well-educated man for his day and time, stopped and told her all about how this had channeled pioneer settlers by the thousands into Kentucky and further westward. He made a little speech about it, I guess. He was that type. He wanted people to learn. And so she well remembered his little talk, parked with a rode on a horseback in the Cumberland Gap. Another thing that she remembered were the white cliffs of Ewing. If you've ever traveled to the Cumberland Gap, not too many miles before you get there, to the right if you're going toward the Gap, there are some beautiful white cliffs that line the top of a ridge to the northwest. Well, they were not the only persons that saw them, because those were landmarks on the road westward. Somehow the news drifted back east, and people who formed wagon trains or horseback caravans to go out there, when they saw the white cliffs of Ewing, they knew that the gateway to the west, the Cumberland Gap, was not far ahead. I made a public address on those one time about the white cliffs of Ewing, how that they served as landmarks along the old wilderness road. to show people that they were approaching the great gateway of much of what they had heard back east. Little Rebecca remembered passing through by those white cliffs, seeing them off to the northwest. When the sun shines on them, it's a beautiful sight. She remembered not a great deal about the trip on until she remembered arrival at the grandfather's home out on what's now King College Road. Of course, they were happy to see her, but it brought also the sad news that the son and his wife had died. They did not know it until they saw this girl being brought home, and of course Mr. Bushong explained the situation to them. They took her in gladly to raise her, and of course they were what people would call old now, probably in their late 50s maybe. What people would call old then, I'm sorry. Now we don't think that. Here I used to think that 70 years old was getting up there, but it doesn't seem that way to me now, having passed that mark. But the neighbors who lived nearby, near to the grandfather's old homestead out there, had a little girl about Rebecca's age. And of course they became fast friends, played together. It so happened that this little girl had a red scarf. It had designs on it, but it was mostly red, basically red, and most children love red. It's actually an angry color. I'm wearing a red tie today, but I don't wear much red. But they say subconsciously it creates a hostility in those that see it. One thing is certain, this is a sideline, but I'm noted for sidelines, off on a side track. You'll never see anything red in a mental institution. They well know that it agitates people. Well, anyway, most children do love red. Well, red's one of the principal colors of Christmas, So, this little child, little orphan Rebecca, wanted a red scarf like her playmate had. The old doting grandfather said, I'll get you one some way or another. The family told him they got theirs at Paperville. Paperville was bigger than Bristol then. It was a good-sized village where the town of Bristol, so-called, only had one house in it at the time. Well, he went over to Paperville, and alas, the merchant told him, I'm out. I do not have any more scarves. But my friend Joseph Anderson is opening his store on the 24th of December, and you might find one there. Well, the doting old grandfather took the news back to Rebecca. She is sad, of course, perhaps cried a little about it, but he said, I'm going to get you a red scarf if I have to walk to Bluntville. Bluntville was a thriving town at the time. But he waited until he saw what Anderson might have. On Christmas, the day before Christmas Eve, it began to snow. And by Christmas Eve morning, there was a heavy snow on the ground. And still snowing, but not so much. People didn't pay much attention to things like that then. If they needed to go, they went. And so he put on his boots and said, I'll be back, and hopefully I'll bring you a red scarf. Well, he trudged through the snow by what's now East Hill Cemetery. It wasn't there then. Down the hill into the valley and found the Anderson home, located on what's now the corner of Martin Luther King Boulevard and State Street. It was then State and 4th. Well, when he got there, no doors were open, so he knocked on the home door, and Aunt Lynn Anderson, Uncle Joe's wife, answered the door. Aunt Lynn Anderson was the epitome of kindness, compassion. Her family practically worshipped her, and they still do today worship her memory, more or less. Well, she said Joe didn't think that there'd be any trade today, so he took one of the slaves and went to the hill yonder to cut wood. Then Mr. Rutherford poured out his story, And Aunt Lynn, being the kind person she was, sent Nehemiah Strange, that was another one of the slaves, to the hill to bring Mr. Anderson home. Well, Anderson obeyed the command or the call, came to the store. He said, I don't know whether I have one or not, but I will certainly look. One of his boxes was novelties, he called it, just odds and ends. And he opened that box, had not opened it before, bear in mind it was a wooden box. And as luck would have it, he did have a red scarf, not exactly like the one the other little girl had, but similar. So the man paid him 10 cents. Now bear in mind, of all the tens of millions of dollars that have changed hands in downtown Bristol since that day, it all started with a 10-cent sale. And that was paid for in barter. Mr. Rutherford had brought some side meat from his smokehouse to pay the 10 cents. He got it, he returned home through the snow, and you may believe and be assured there was one happy girl in Sullivan County, Tennessee that night. In fact, she was so pleased with that gift that she told her daughter, whom I knew well, that she spread it on her pillow that night and slept on it. She highly treasured it. Now, not so much, I'm sure, with the being so proud of a gift or a Christmas gift, but it meant something to her. It meant love and acceptance and security to an orphan girl, and so it was a greater treasure to her than it would have been to any other person unless they had been in her position. Well, she grew up with her grandparents. They lived long enough to we'll say short adulthood. She married when she was 16. Did very well in marriage, got a good husband, and lived long. Rebecca died at the age of 94. That was just before I got here, of course. But when I came here, she had an aged daughter who incidentally had married a man of the same name as was her birth name, but he was no relation as far as could be determined. But Rebecca, even though she lived to be long and married well, her daughter did not do so well. She lived to be old, certainly, but her man was not as provident as had been Rebecca's husband. And so she retained, even when I knew her, some of that refinement and dignity that had been instilled into her in a good family. But she had come to be in poverty. Her husband had died many years before. He'd become an alcoholic and had died early. And she was living in a poverty-stricken area of Bristol, Tennessee. And of course, I, soon after I came here, went into social work, and it fell my lot to tend to her case, take care of her case. I visited often in her home. She tried her best to entertain me in a way that she knew, any way she knew how. But she well learned that I, even then, had become very interested in local history. Had a great deal of interest in it. And she would sit for hours and tell me about older times in Bristol and out near Paperville where she grew up. And for about a year, I tried to help her with what we could in the way of social services. Well, one day she told me the story I'm telling you, and had her daughter to go in the back room, open an old trunk back there, and bring out something she wanted to show me. What she showed me was the little red scarf that had been given to her mother on Christmas Day, or Christmas Eve Day, in 1853. The mother had kept it, all those years. Now, once Anderson's store became very large, it got so big with such great offerings that you could buy anything from a toothpick to a grand piano in Anderson's store. He built a fine three-story building to hold all of it. But at that time, he was across the street from where he later built. Now, his final store was at 410 State. That number will ring a bell with many of my viewers out there. 410 State is the number of the building where the country music started in 1927. It's the same building that he built. It burned on February the 19th, 1945, but that's where it was. His son took over the business. Anderson found out he could make more money in banking, and he was one that always had an eye as to how to make money. So he turned the store over to his son and his nephew, became Anderson and Carr. Well, John C. knew that story. He knew what was sold first. His daddy had told him, and his mother especially had told him many times about it. He wanted that scarf to make an exhibit in the store of how it all began. He offered her a big price for it. Finally, he thought he'd entice her. He offered her a fine, fancy Victorian bedroom suit with marble top dresses. He thought that would do the trick, but it didn't. Even though she could have probably used it, she kept the scarf instead. In the spring of 1954, I don't know the exact day. I don't know why I didn't keep a record of that. All I know is that it was apple blooming time. The apple trees had burst forth in beautiful array of blossoms. I love that time of the year. From now on through this winter, I'll be looking forward to it. I don't endure cold very well. When others are warm, I'm freezing. People laugh at me. I'll have the heat on in the home and sitting near the fireplace, not the fireplace, but where it's a heat pump. I'll be sitting near that with a insulated coat on and very comfortable, whereas others are burning up in the house. But anyway, I look forward to spring, and it'll come fast if I keep busy, and I don't have any trouble keeping busy. So it'll be here before you know it. I'll start looking for crocus in late January, and once in a while I've found them that early in winter time. Anyway, in apple blooming time, someone came from that poverty-stricken area and told me that your old friend is dying. I hastened over there and passed an apple tree in bloom on the way. That's why I know it was apple blooming time. She was indeed on her deathbed, and yet she was able to talk a little, and she told her daughter, "Go back yonder in that old trunk and bring that red scarf out here. This man has become so interested in history, and this is one of the most important aspects of our history, is when Bristol started and how merchandising started in Bristol, and that first article sold was a Christmas gift." She brought it out. She passed it to me, handed it to me, and said, "Bud, I want you to keep this. Mother treasured it so highly, and I have treasured it all my life, and I want you to keep it. I have kept it. It is wrapped in acid-free paper to keep it from deteriorating further." Look, my friend, you have a great opportunity. You never thought you'd see the first article sold in a Bristol store, did you? You never thought you'd see the first Christmas gift passed in Bristol, did you? You have lived to see it today. If you like a better view, come to my home sometime and I'll show it to you. I'm planning to have it framed, put under glass where it won't fade away, and then I hope somebody somewhere down the road will treasure it as much as 3 generations already have, and will keep it here in the town where it belongs. My friend, I close by wishing you all a very happy holiday season. and the best of everything in the coming new year. And as I always say at the conclusion of all my programs, whatever, may the best in life be yours.